Good afternoon and welcome to the Center for Geopolitics event. I'm Brendan Sims, the Director of the Center for Geopolitics. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that this session is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming days at the links being shown in the chat. Our speaker this afternoon is Marie Sarotte. She is an expert in the history of international relations and the inaugural holder of the Marie-Josée and Henry R. Kravis Distinguished Professorship of Historical Studies at the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs, as well as a research associate at Harvard University's Center for European Studies. Professor Sarotte gained her AB in History and Science at Harvard and her PhD in History at Yale University. After graduating, Professor Sarotte was a White House Fellow before joining the faculty at the University of Cambridge and then returning to the United States to teach at the University of Southern California. Professor Sarotte is a former Humboldt Scholar, a former member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She is the author or editor of 6 books, and her other recent publications include Collapse, The Accidental Opening of the Berlin Wall, 2014, and 1989, The Struggle to Create a Post-Cold War Europe, which are both selected as Financial Times Books of the Year, among other awards. The book we'll be talking about today, Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of Post-Cold War Stalemate, 2021, is Professor Sarotte's latest work, which was selected as one of Foreign Affairs' best books of 2021 and the Financial Times' best books to read in 2022. I'd like to say 2 more things at the start. First, that this is an absolutely stupendous book. I stress this because I don't necessarily agree with all of it, but you should all buy it. I hold up my own copy. Secondly, it is self-evidently a highly topical book. We'll come to that later, but I would like the main focus of our discussion to be on the history, on what actually happened, and then of course we will turn to what it might mean for today. So Mary, I'd now like to turn to you, and you're going to summarize your main arguments for us briefly.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brendan. Honored to be here. Thank you for calling my book stupendous. That's new. I haven't actually heard that yet, so thank you. And I look forward to hearing where we may have points of disagreement that I think could be interesting for the audience. Yes, we hardly could know, Brendan, when we started emailing last year about setting up this event. I believe it took us about 3 months to get it on the calendar. We could hardly know that these tragic events would surround our actual meeting today. And they make this history all the more pressing because the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, has been instrumentalizing his corrupted version of this history as a justification for what he is doing to Ukrainians. That is obviously abhorrent. And I believe that it is incumbent upon us as historians to make, our small contribution to this cause by providing evidence-backed narratives of these critical histories. It's obviously nothing compared to what the people in Ukraine are currently suffering, but it feels like something that I can do, something that I can offer. And it feels like contributing a little bit because you and I do have the skills to push back against false narratives. So thank you for giving me the chance to do this today. Brendan, I also before this event thought that in light of how current this is and how many open questions there are, this event will be more interesting as a discussion between myself and him and in response to your questions rather than my inflicting death by PowerPoint on you. So I'm actually just going to make very brief remarks and then I'm happy to get into the details as you choose, Brendan. As a matter of fact, I just want to make one remark, and it's about the tension between event and process, because I believe that both summarizes my book and also helps us to understand what's going on now. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, as my friend and colleague, Professor Serhiy Plokhy at Harvard has written, the collapse of the Soviet Union is not an event, it's a process. We in the West tend to think of it as having happened on December 26, 1991, and then being over. That is an inaccurate assessment. The collapse of the Soviet Union is a long, messy, bloody process, and what we are seeing, I submit, is part of it. Empires do not go gracefully into oblivion. Empires die long, protracted, messy deaths. And there is a lot of fighting over the final borders of the shrunken empire. And I believe that that is what we are seeing now, among all the other historical factors that are coming in. The American military analyst, Michael Kaufman, who, if you're not following him on Twitter, you should be, because he's the most knowledgeable public figure on the Russian military. Michael Kaufman has referred to what is happening similarly as the wars of Soviet succession, the wars of Soviet succession. And I believe that is accurate. So I believe in order to understand what is happening now, you must understand the history, and you must understand in particular what that history did to Vladimir Putin. Or as I said in the Financial Times this weekend, it may be, looking back at the end of the Cold War, the most important outcome may not be the optimism that it inspired in the many, but the damage that it did to the one, namely Vladimir Putin, who was, of course, posted as a KGB agent in East Germany, in Dresden, saw with his own two eyes the collapse of Soviet authority, and decided it was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. Now, if you think about that for a minute, there's quite a bit of competition for that title. And Brendan knows this well, greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. But Vladimir Putin's answer is the collapse of Soviet control. He tried in his limited ways in 1989, when he was there in Dresden, to fight back personally. He threatened to shoot protesters. He called local Soviet military forces and tried to get military backup. He did everything possible, even at that time, to use violence against the peaceful protesters. When he called for military backup from a nearby military base, he was in the KGB, the secret police. When he called the military base and said, "I need armed backup, I want to shoot these people," the person who answered the phone said, "I will not send that backup without express authorization from Moscow," and Moscow is silent. Moscow is silent. And Putin has consistently repeated ever afterward that those words haunted him, that Moscow should not have been silent. Moscow should not have pulled out of Eastern Europe. And today, Moscow is not silent. So I think you need to understand this, these events, this Soviet collapse is in some ways a process that is still ongoing, certainly in Vladimir Putin's mind, and that this is a driving factor in what he is doing today. A corollary point there, we talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union being within living memory. For Putin, this is within lived memory, lived memory. In other words, if you think about the West, there's been a whole host of leaders since 1989, right? In the United States, we had President George H.W. Bush, then we had Bill Clinton, then we had George W. Bush, then we had Barack Obama, then we had Donald Trump, right? You think about how many prime ministers there have been in Britain. But Putin has been there. Putin was there in 1989, and then he went back from his home in a collapsing East Germany to a collapsing Soviet Union, climbed the greasy pole of politics, and became acting president in 1999. So these events are lived memory for him, and they press on him, and he clearly has many grievances about them. One of the more important consequences of the pandemic is that it isolated him nearly alone with his grievances, since he's extremely COVID phobic, apparently, and now sees very few people. So he appears to have nurtured these grievances and decided that Moscow can no longer be silent. Last point, so event and process. So in my book, I focus on the story of the fight between the US and Russia over NATO expansion. I chose to do that because I was worried, deeply worried, that it might come to the kind of conflict that we are seeing today. I did not expect it to come so soon or escalate so quickly, but I did see conflict on the horizon, and I wanted to tell the story of how we had gotten from the optimism of the end of the Cold War to the tense state of US-Russian relations as of when the book closed, which was about a year ago. And I feared that worse was to come, and I would have been happy to be wrong. So I have very mixed feelings about what is happening, because as a sort of cold-blooded analyst, I am, satisfied that my analysis was correct, but as a warm-blooded human being, I'm horrified by what is happening to the Ukrainians. And what I talk about in the book is the way that NATO enlargement contributed to the deterioration of US-Russian relations. I emphasize that word contributed. My book does not say that NATO expansion is the only reason US-Russian relations deteriorated. In fact, as my students have heard me say many times, the only phenomenon that I have never seen as a historian is monocausality. Important events happen for multiple reasons. The fight over NATO expansion is only one part of the story. but it's an important part of the story. And it is a useful way to understand the 1990s, which, as Brendan knows because he's written about them, are a turbulent, messy decade. There is so much going on in the 1990s. There is the collapse of the Soviet Empire, creating a host of new states. There is the spread of market economies, neoliberalism, and democracy. There is the rise of brave protesters from prisons to the presidency. There is the opening of a new realm of the possible for the international liberal order. But there is also the rise of in the Balkans, ethnic cleansing, bloodshed, and also the beginnings of de-democratization. The 1990s are an unruly decade. So it is necessary to narrativize the 90s. In other words, in order to get from the beginning to the end of the 90s, you need a story to follow. Otherwise, you will just get lost in the details, locations, plots, etc. And so my through line, what I held on to going through the 1990s, was the fight between the US and Russia over NATO expansion. Now, there are other through lines. Brendan has worked on the Balkans, and of course, I think there's more to be written there about the way the disintegration of the Balkans brought the world beyond that moment of optimism. I think you could write a book about the expansion or non-expansion of the EU in the 90s, using that as your through line. The historian Philip Terr has already done something similar, using the expansion of neoliberalism as his through line. So my through line was the fight between the US and Russia over NATO expansion. And as I researched that, I realized that it was the opposite of what Serhii Plokhy said. So NATO expansion was a process that, in my mind, should have been an event. It was a process that should have been an event. If there's one big takeaway from my book, and I'll wrap up on this point so we can get to the discussion. If there's one big takeaway from my book, it's that NATO expansion was not one thing. I think this has gotten lost in the debate. There are people who are pro-enlargement and people who are anti, and they yell at each other, and that's been kind of it. I'm trying to bring nuance to this discussion. I'm trying to show that there were a spectrum of possibilities for how you enlarge NATO, and that was non-trivial. So, for example, the British, as I talk about in my book, said very clearly to the Americans, and this I think was wise advice, we should enlarge NATO in the post-Cold War world once. Right? We may not necessarily say in public that it's going to be once, because in public we want to talk about being welcoming. But in reality, we should enlarge NATO once in the 1990s. We should look around, we should pick the most able countries, and we should put a big bunch of them in and then be done, because the chances that we'll be able to get away with this without aggravating Russia are very slim. That I think was wise advice, but instead the Clinton administration pushed back, and particularly Strobe Talbot, Clinton's main Russia advisor, and said, no, 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 that is the exact wrong thing to do. We must do the exact opposite. NATO enlargement must be an open-ended process. It must be clear that it's going to happen and keep happening, that there's going to be unlimited rounds and unlimited geographic reach. We, in fact, should take the smallest number of countries at the beginning to make absolutely clear that it's going to keep happening. So there was this clash between London and Washington won. And so the manner of NATO enlargement that Washington chose was the one that maximized friction with Russia at a time when Russia was becoming a democracy for the first time in its history and was most in need of friends. And that was why I decided to call the book Not One Inch. The title initially refers to the controversy over the US Secretary of State James Baker saying to Mikhail Gorbachev, NATO will move not 1 inch eastward. That's obviously a famous controversy that's been publicized all around the world, and we can talk about that in detail if we want to. But I realized in the course of writing the book that not 1 inch had another meaning. As you go through the 1990s, following my through line, it became apparent that the Americans began to think the opposite, that not 1 inch of territory needed to be off limits to NATO. There should be this unending expansion process, this open-ended process. The Brits were totally wrong. The key was to, not rule out 1 inch. And that, I think, it was the problem. To wrap it up in a nutshell, my book is not an anti-NATO expansion book. The problem was not NATO enlargement. The problem was how it happened. And this not 1 inch left out manner contributed to friction with Russia at a time when it was most in need of a cooperative relationship with the US, and has contributed to, not caused, but has contributed to the deterioration of US-Russian relations. So that's a gallop through the nearly 600-page book in a few minutes. Happy to answer any detailed questions that you have, Brendan.
Thank you very much for unpacking the topic for us in such a lucid fashion. And I can only reiterate that members of the audience should buy and read the book, because it's worth every page of it. It certainly gives me a different through route through the 1990s than I'd had before. And many things I saw differently, particularly this question of NATO enlargement, where I think Mary's put her finger on something really, really important, which has then resonated to the present day. But I'd like to start, I guess, with a question from one historian to another, which is, could you tell us a little bit about how this book fits into your wider intellectual development? I mean, it's part of a trilogy. You know, what was it that made you write the book in the first place? There has to be a sort of a reason, something that's driving you, and how then it forms part of the larger whole, which it plainly does. Could you say a little bit about that?
Certainly. Ultimately, the answer to why I do what I do is that I was studying abroad in West Berlin in 1989. Mm-hmm. And at the time, it seemed like it was going to be a fun year abroad before going probably to medical school. I hadn't decided, but obviously studying abroad in West Berlin in 1989 was a life-changing experience. And to a certain extent, I'm still trying to answer the questions that arose in my mind then, although now, fortunately, as a trained historian who had the benefit of being trained at Yale University in the history program, I did not know originally that I was going to be writing a trilogy. Essentially, one question, as so often, as you know, Brendan, one question led to another. And in my next life, I'll write the books in the correct order. So they weren't written in this order, but roughly speaking, my first question, which I addressed in this book, was simply how and why did the Berlin Wall come down? And this is a deep dive, a close focus, as you know, into the events that led to the unintended opening of the wall. But then once that happens, the question is what's going to happen to political order in Europe, and obviously what's going to happen to Germany. And so this book is about the process of German unification. Minor footnote, I actually wanted to call this book 1990. And the publisher said, absolutely not, that would be terrible for sales. But this book is about the process of German unification. The net result was that nearly every single reviewer said, although this book is called 1989, it's mostly about 1990. I'm like, tell me about it. But newsflash, aspiring authors out there, the press has final control over the title. Then as I got done with that, as I researched these books, which were primarily driven by interest in Germany, I came across mountains of documents on NATO expansion. And this I did not expect, because the tenor of the literature at the time was it never came up. This was a myth. Mm-hmm. And by the way, Gorbachev still says this, right? Because he's trying to improve his historic image. Mm-hmm. This is worth perhaps a moment, because this has been in circulation so much recently. The former leader of the Soviet Union, the last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, said in 2014 in an interview to mark the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, he said, the issue of NATO expansion never came up when I was in office, never. He then switched to describing himself in the third person. So this is Gorbachev talking about himself. He then said to the journalist trying to shape the coverage, don't you dare portray Gorbachev as a naive person. If there was any naivete, it was later, it was subsequent Russian leaders. NATO expansion never came up. Gorbachev didn't miss that issue. It came up later. It never happened on my watch. So in other words, he's very much trying to shape his image. The problem is that Gorbachev 1990 directly contradicts Gorbachev from 2014, because it's clear from his notes, Baker's notes, multiple sources that in fact he did discuss NATO and so forth. So yeah, so there I am researching my other books, and I'm coming across all these materials from Gorbachev 1990 about NATO expansion, and I'm realizing they just don't fit with the image that I'm seeing of NATO expansion that clearly is part of the story. So I started writing articles initially, and those got such a huge response that I thought, you know, I should actually try to do a book-length treatment of this. And then I thought what I really like to do is take the story forward to when NATO actually enlarges into Central and Eastern Europe, which is 1999. Now, the problem there is that, as you know, as a historian, we need to work from high-quality sources, and those documents were not yet declassified from the Clinton Library. So I decided to start a full frontal assault on the Clinton Library to try to get sources declassified. I began in 2015, and I really ramped it up in the years after that. And in particular, I went after the transcripts of the summits between Bill Clinton, American President Bill Clinton, and Russian President Boris Yeltsin. In other words, the Bill-Boris bromance in print. And it took me 3 years of appeals, but I got those documents, and they are now freely available, by the way, on the Clinton Presidential Library website for you and any students of yours who wish to do research projects. And then a remarkable thing happened when my appeal succeeded after 3 years in 2018. And I can put a link in the chat, actually, to some of these documents. When my appeal succeeded in 2018 and the documents were released when I won, the Kremlin complained. Peskov, the spokesman for Putin, issued a statement criticizing the Clinton Library, asking them to take these documents back, with the justification that they revealed too much about currently active politicians, meaning above all Peskov's boss, Vladimir Putin. And I thought, well, if the Kremlin is complaining, then these sources must be good. And I wasn't disappointed. And so once I had that, then it was clear that I had, more than enough. I was also doing this with the State Department, the Defense Department, the UK Freedom of Information Act. I worked in 6 countries. So in essence, I created my own archive in order to actually tell this story ahead of when you would usually be able to get these sources. It was by far the hardest thing I've ever done. If I'd known how hard it was going to be at the beginning, I don't know if I could do it again. And just the sheer administrative task of keeping these declassifications going while incorporating them into a narrative was extremely difficult. But I'm glad that I did, because now I feel, the best way to understand something is to write a book about it. And I feel that I have a good understanding of some of the origins of these profound and profoundly important events that are happening today. I'll conclude by saying I believe that historical work is the most effective way to develop a deep understanding of significant events. And I know you share that. And even though it was really very difficult, I was pleased that it came to a good conclusion.
Thank you. Now, you are very much, as well as being a historian of the international system, if you like, you're also a Germanist, an expert on Germany. And one of the things that comes across very clearly in this latest book is the centrality of Germany and the German question. And could you say a little bit more about the way in which the 1990 settlement is both a post-World War and a post-Cold War settlement? In a sense, one was winding up 2 wars, wasn't one? And that then had a bearing on the future of NATO. Could you elaborate for the audience a little bit on that?
Yes, certainly. I just put some of those documents that I mentioned in the chat, by the way. Yeah. Yes. So as the wall is coming down in 1989, it's clear that the Germans want to reunite. The question is how. It can't just happen because, as you know all too well, as a result of the Second World War, in 1989, 1990, there are still 4 victor powers in Germany. And by the way, congratulations on your recent book on the Second World War. So it's a little fuzzy because there had been some intermediate accords between 1945 and 1989, 1990. But to a first order approximation, let's just say Germany is still an occupied country. Certainly for the East German territory, that's a fair statement. So Nazi Germany in 1945 surrendered unconditionally. And that was unconditional. So there was no time limit. There were no limits of any kind on an unconditional surrender. So even though it's 40 years later, that surrender still has consequences. It means that there are the 4 victor powers in Germany. They retain extensive legal rights, and they still have troops there. In particular, the Soviet Union, which has nearly 380,000 troops in what is then the state of East Germany. So in order for Germany to unify, because the West is in agreement with Germany unifying, that means the Soviets have to be convinced. They have to be convinced to give up their legal rights over the country, and particularly over the divided city of Berlin. And they have to be convinced to pull their troops out. And so the question is, how do you accomplish that? And this is the origin of the 1990 controversy, because in a speculative conversation in early 1990, trying to figure out how it might be possible to convince Gorbachev to give up his hold on Germany, James Baker does say, how about this? Again, it's in a hypothetical way, but he says, how about this? How about you let your half of Germany go, and we agree that NATO moves not 1 inch eastward? And Gorbachev indicates general assent, but he does not actually get anything codified or written down. And then this is where, Brendan, as you very presciently asked, this is where the German role becomes very important. And in a sense, I almost wanted to call the book Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, Germany and the Making the Post-Cold War Order. But once again, that was vetoed by my publisher. So I was unable to do that. It's too long and wordy. But as you've correctly sensed, the role of Germany is a major thread throughout the book. And part of the Not 1 Inch controversy is the German role, which often gets ignored. So at the day after James Baker says that hypothetical line, how about you let your half of Germany go and we agree NATO moves not 1 inch eastward, and both Baker and Gorbachev agree in a kind of a tentative way. They agree, yeah, that's not a bad idea. Let's talk about that. Baker flies home and Helmut Kohl, the German chancellor, West German chancellor, and Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the West German foreign minister, come to Russia immediately after him. So you've had Baker in Moscow saying those words going home, and then you have Kohl and Genscher coming in. So two things happen that are important almost within a few days. Baker goes home, tells his boss and friend, President George H.W. Bush, what he said, and Bush says to Baker, no, that's wrong. That is not our position. We don't see any reason to give that away. Bush, as he said about himself, I don't do the vision thing. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. From his point of view, NATO had just won the Cold War, right? Why give it up? Why give up its ability to expand? And so Bush makes clear to Baker that, what the United States is going to do instead is that it is going to expand its Article 5 responsibilities beyond the Cold War line. Article 5 is the part of the NATO treaty. It's the heart of the treaty. It's the clause that says an attack on one will be treated as an attack on all. And Bush says to Baker, we've got to move several inches beyond the Cold War line, because otherwise the whole eastern half of the newly united Germany won't be in NATO. We'll have a united Germany that's half in and half out. That makes no sense. So what we're going to do is we are going to move Article 5 beyond the Cold War line. We're just going to make concessions as we do that. And Baker says, right. And one of the newest documents that I found right at the end, as I was literally in page proofs, but I got it in, is a note from Baker writing back to the Germans saying, sorry, forget about that language, forget about it. It's causing confusion. We're going to drop all that not 1 inch language. But it took Moscow a while to notice, in part because of what's happened with the Germans, right? So Baker has gone home. He's having this conversation with Bush. He's being reined in. Meanwhile, the Germans who are in Moscow, they see this line as a great way to get what they want, which is German unification. So even though Kohl is aware that Bush thinks differently, Kohl uses this line with Gorbachev too. So the next day, Kohl says something very similar about let Germany unify and NATO will move not 1 inch eastward. And Gorbachev makes the same kind of, provisional response. But in contrast to Baker, Kohl then decides to act upon this. And this, I really think, is a key moment in the whole German unification story. Kohl says, great, thanks. He walks out the door, calls a press conference and says, Gorbachev has given the green light for Germany expanding, and we're going to start monetary union tomorrow. People forget this, that economic and monetary union started in the spring and was done by the summer, even well before political unification. And behind the scenes in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev was horrified. He was like, that is insane arrogance. Why is he doing that, right? I didn't do this, right? But somehow Moscow couldn't get its act together to crush that story that Kohl was developing in public. So in other words, this phrase, not 1 inch, when Kohl says it leads to direct action. In other words, Gorbachev was in that awful position of giving something away without getting anything in exchange. So that's one of the ways that Germany becomes really important. And then, and this will be the last part of my answer to this question, you then fast forward to 1997. Now, Clinton is president in the US, Yeltsin is president in Russia. The Central and Eastern Europeans are clamoring to be in NATO. Clinton is indicating he wants to do that. And Yeltsin and the Russians come back and say, you cannot do that. No can do, because of 1990. And the Americans say, what do you mean? And what becomes apparent is that the Americans and the Russians agree on one thing. They agree that the final settlement of 1990, which is when Gorbachev finally gave up his troops and his hold over Germany in exchange for huge financial incentives. He never got that NATO enlargement pledge. The Americans and the Russians agree that that final settlement from 1990 deals only with Germany. They agree on that. What they cannot agree on is what that means. So Yeltsin says, look, we had that treaty. It dealt only with Germany. It does not allow you to do anything else anywhere in Central and Eastern Europe. You could only expand Article 5 into Eastern Germany. And the Americans say, no, 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 you've got that exactly wrong. it's true, the treaty deals only with Germany. That's the point. The treaty says nothing about Central and Eastern Europe. We can do whatever we want in Central and Eastern Europe. And so you have this great clash of wills, and the Germans come in and the Germans say, ha, 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 ha. Okay, yeah, the Russians, yeah, they're right legally within the four corners of the document. It doesn't refer to any other countries, but it did come up in our discussions. And the Americans say, so what, right? This is the top level. This is the great power relations. If you didn't get it written down, that was another presidential administration. And so you see this conflict over 97, where Yeltsin feels like he should have been able to stop expansion. So that's one of the reasons why Putin has been referring back to both 1990 and 1997, because he feels like he got betrayed twice, or Russia got betrayed twice. The Soviet Union and Russia got betrayed twice. And there's a crucial German role in that whole story. So I think you really cannot understand these events without a German role. And as I said, I really actually wanted to call the book America, Russia, Germany, and the Making Post-Cold War Order, and my publisher vetoed it. But fortunately, people like you, Brendan, notice the German thread and bring it out. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So the last question I'm going to ask before we get into the issues and queries coming in from the audience, they're basically cascading in. So, but I think we need to zero home in on this question of the promise or not a promise. And I think perhaps actually I agree with you after all. We'll see in a minute as to how this works out. So my understanding of what you're saying then is that there isn't actually a promise on the American side not to expand NATO, which is then broken. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that is correct. What it rests upon, frankly, is how you define promise, which is in some ways more of a psychological than history question. Just to briefly answer that question, my position is that there was no promise. In fact, what is in writing, the final settlement on Germany, explicitly allows Article 5 to move eastward beyond the Cold War line, and Moscow authorized signature of that treaty. So Moscow signed a treaty allowing NATO to enlarge eastward. Putin never brings this up. So my definition of a promise between international states is something you have written down and signed. So there is no promise. That being said, you have this American position, which is not tenable on the basis of evidence, that the issue never came up. Right? No one ever uttered it. The Russians are psychotic. That is not tenable on the basis of evidence. I can prove, multiple times over without breaking a sweat how many times it came up. And so what I think is a tenable position is that the Russians were led to believe in verbal conversations that they would have a promise, right? But the Russians are big boys, right? They're a superpower. They know that if you want something in a negotiation, you get it written down, right? I mean, this is standard, negotiation. And the sad truth is that Mikhail Gorbachev, who I admire greatly, who I think deserves the Nobel Peace Prize for not using violence to respond to the crumbling of Soviet power, who kept Moscow silent, it turns out he was a very poor negotiator. And so he would get these kind of people would, say things he wanted to hear verbally, and he would sort of nod and then be shocked later when it wasn't the case because it wasn't written down. So that's a nutshell summary. Sorry to interrupt you, Brendan.
Okay, so be a fair summing up would be that a kite was flown by Jim Baker that this might be a possible solution of not enlarging NATO in general beyond Germany, because there is also a school of thought that says it only applies to Germany, but in any case, it was only a kite. It was repudiated by the president on his return, and subsequently the Soviet Union, in any case, accepted in writing the possibility of subsequent enlargement. I think that's very important for the audience to realize that that's what you're saying, because I think that's otherwise some people might come away with the impression that a promise was given. Not that you're saying that, but just that might be what they think, because all these issues are weaponized then in various discussions. And that brings us, in fact, then to the alternatives, which you chart very eloquently, particularly with regard to the different forms of NATO enlargement. I mean, I think what comes across very clearly in the book is that you're not against NATO enlargement, but you question the way in which it was done. But we do have a query here from David Lane, and he wants to know, well, why did NATO even have to continue in 1990? Wouldn't it have been perfectly viable to say, revert to the CSE, which I think you said that was really Genscher's, the German foreign minister's, favored option. So what would you say to David on that?
Yes, certainly. There were many options proposed at the time other than continuing with NATO. For example, there was a more dramatic option proposed by many of the dissidents who had risen from prisons to presidencies. You have to remember that these people, many of them were pacifists. Now, to be a pacifist in the Warsaw Pact meant to have your future canceled. If you didn't do military service, it meant you weren't going to university, you were going to be assigned work as a janitor, you were not going to get good housing. In other words, there was considerable personal cost attached to pacifism. And many of the brave protesters in solidarity in Poland and East Germany, they wanted to get rid of both the Soviet bloc, the Warsaw Pact, and NATO. They wanted no military blocs at all. And once they came into political power, they tabled a serious proposal, tabled in the American sense, which is put on the table, advanced, a serious proposal to dissolve the borders of all of the states in Central and Eastern Europe and to create a neutral zone that was denuclearized and demilitarized forever as a neutral bridge of peace between East and West. They felt that this was the only possible response to all of the horrors that had been visited on the world from Central and Eastern Europe, such as the Holocaust. Now, you can say that would have been crazy, but that would have been a new world order, right? And then you also had Genscher saying that NATO and the Warsaw Pact should dissolve into a common composite of collective security under the umbrella of the CSCE, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. The people who really hated that idea were the Americans, right? President George H.W. Bush said, no way are we going to demilitarize Europe, right? We just won the Cold War. Why are we going to do that? And so Bush felt very, very strongly that he needed to perpetuate NATO, even though, as you rightly point out, it had been designed to defend Western Europe from the Soviet Union, and that had now happened. That Soviet Union was now, crumbling. Bush felt strongly that if it ain't broke, you don't fix it. He felt strongly that it was essential to perpetuate not only NATO, but also its ability to enlarge. Now, the political scientists in the audience will not be surprised because they know from their studies that institutions are sticky, meaning if an institution exists, it will almost certainly continue to exist. That is not surprising. In essence, Bush's preferred outcome was the most likely outcome. What was surprising was Bush's ability to call it a new world order, because it wasn't. It was very much a perpetuation of the Cold War order, which makes sense because that was hugely advantageous to the United States. So basically, I'm saying to David Lane, the historical actors at the time tried. There were multiple proposed visions for getting rid of NATO, but ultimately George H.W. Bush was able to succeed. Now, the interesting player in this is, again, the Germans and Helmut Kohl. Bush's interest was preserving NATO. Kohl's interest is unifying Germany. Those are not synonymous, right? There exist scenarios where Helmut Kohl makes a deal with Moscow where Germany becomes neutral in exchange for unification. And given Germany's significance as the frontline status, as the frontline state, given the number of foreign troops in Germany, given the fact that Germany at the end of the Cold War had more nuclear weapons per square mile than anywhere on Earth, if Germany had pulled out of NATO, it's hard to see how NATO survived, right? So part of the tension I describe in the book is Bush trying to keep Kohl on side and make clear to Kohl that Germany can only unify in NATO, which is not a given. And there are some fraught moments. There's a moment where the Germans agree to meet the Soviets without telling the Americans. And man, does that ring alarm bells in Washington. They say that, they find out from the Soviets who let that slip. And they come down on the Germans like a ton of bricks and say, we are not going to find out from the Soviets that you guys are meeting. That is not happening ever again. Do you understand us? And so Washington really puts pressure on the Germans to make this goal of keeping NATO and its ability to expand and keeping Germany, uniting Germany. They push and push and push to make sure those are in fact linked and one and the same. Again, not an obvious outcome, but Bush convinces Kohl that he can get away with it. And as the deputy national security advisor, Bob Gates, put it, this is the later Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates. Bob Gates says, we developed a joint strategy, and that was bribing the Soviets out. So in other words, we're not going to compromise on NATO. We're going to give the Soviets a ton of money to pull out, and the West Germans are going to pay the bribe. And so they agree on that. And so that's why then in the final treaty, It's the opposite of a promise not to expand. The final treaty explicitly allows NATO to move Article 5 eastward across the Cold War line and to repeat Gorbachev authorized a signature. In other words, he shifts his priorities, and he agrees to give up that goal in exchange for a pile of money. Again, to come back to this question of promise, I think it depends on what you mean as a promise. I do not think there was a promise, because to me that would be something writing in binding. But as you said, and this is important, it is a kite that gets flown, right? And the question is what the Soviets took away from that. So I don't think there's any point to repeating this idea that somehow it never came up and the Russians are crazy. It came up. It was a kite. So I think how you phrased it was very accurate, Brendan.
Yes, you've shown very clearly that it was out there in the ether,
yes.
Resonating around. Really interesting documents you have there. But not, in fact, as you say, a promise or anything like. In fact, the opposite was nailed down in the treaty. Now, let's move to the question of how NATO was to enlarge, which is another fascinating aspect of your book. And as you say, that it should probably have been a one-off event, as the British suggested, rather than this continuous process that the Americans favored. And that prompts the inevitable question, which was also in my mind, but it actually comes from Dr. Donatas Kupčiūnas, who's the Baltic Geopolitics Research Fellow here at the center. And he asked, well, in that case, Mary, how far should it have been? So should it have included Ukraine and the 3 Baltic states? I mean, what would hypothetically, in your view, the ideal enlargement have been?
Yes, that is one of the main themes of the book. I phrase it not in terms of geography, but in terms of method. So in the book, I spend a great deal of time on something called the Partnership for Peace. And let me explain why. In the early 1990s, there was a great deal of optimism and cooperation between Washington and Moscow over nuclear disarmament. In fact, it was the greatest period of nuclear disarmament since the dawn of the atomic age. And in particular, the US Pentagon, first under Secretary of Defense Les Aspin, and then under Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, these are Clinton's defense secretaries, the Pentagon works very, very closely with Moscow to dismantle, destroy, secure the former Soviet nuclear arsenal. Ironically for today, Washington and Moscow work very closely together to denuclearize Ukraine. There is a debate. This was actually very interesting. This was a new finding. There was a debate inside the late George H.W. Bush presidency about whether to do that. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, once it was clear that the Soviet Union was crumbling, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney said, we should do everything possible to break apart the Soviet Union. And we should be very happy about the fact that the Soviet arsenal is going to end up in at least 4 new states, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Because that's weaponry that's not under Moscow's control. That's fantastic. And James Baker says, you are crazy, Dick Cheney. That is like Yugoslavia with nukes, right? We're going to have all these amateurs with nuclear weapons. That is more dangerous than Moscow keeping control. At least in Moscow, those are the devils we know and they're professionals. It is utterly essential that there be only one nuclear power to emerge from the Soviet Union, and that must be Russia. This is in our existential interest. And Cheney says, you are absolutely wrong. And this is a huge split inside the George H.W. Bush administration that has really been kept closed until now. There was an interview with Scowcroft about it that he would only let be released after his death in 2020 that really brought this to light. And then Scowcroft actually even sided with Cheney. Scowcroft, Brent Scowcroft, the national security advisor, said, I think the arsenal in the hands of 4 weak states, 3 of them without even any real command and control abilities, I think that's less dangerous. But Baker said no. Baker was convinced, and Baker got Bush on his side. And so this cooperation already started under the George H.W. Bush administration with Moscow to get all of the Soviet arsenal back into Russia. That's an interesting strategic call. Like, we could talk about that. Like, what if Cheney had won? What if Scowcroft had won? But Baker won. So you have this close cooperation that already starts under Baker. And then George H.W. Bush loses the election and the Clinton team comes in, but they build on that cooperation. And so they continue to get the arsenal to Russia and also to destroy and dismantle the arsenal. And then the Central and Eastern Europeans start pressing to become NATO members, full members, which is their right. They were new democracies, new sovereign states. They had the right to choose their security alliances. They wanted to join NATO. That was perfectly within their right. NATO had enlarged before, so NATO enlargement was neither unprecedented nor unreasonable. I think that was all reasonable. The problem then is how it happens. And here I agree with Bill Perry, who, when he hears this is happening, goes into President Clinton and says words roughly to the following. The exact quotation is in my book, Not 1 Inch, but roughly he says, President Clinton, I have the highest respect for Central and Eastern Europeans. I have the highest respect for Lech Walesa and for Václav Havel. I have no doubt that they want to join NATO. The problem is that Bill Perry, I'm the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America, and my job is to make America as safe as possible. And I'm currently doing the best job ever because I am destroying missiles pointed at the United States together with Moscow. I am making America safer by the day. And if you expand NATO, that will annoy Moscow. It will hinder my ability to do that. It will move Moscow's hand a little bit back towards the trigger button. And that is not in the interest of the US government. So do not do this, Mr. President. This is not in American interest. And the Pentagon was very strongly against NATO enlargement. But Clinton, had these countervailing pressures. And then there were also people like the State Department diplomat Dick Holbrooke, who really wanted NATO to enlarge. And so Clinton came up with a compromise that I think was very sensible policy. And he did this together with Perry, together with his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, John Szalekaszwili, who had been born in Poland, so was very sympathetic to Polish concerns. But they recognized that there was this potential for this longer term friction with Russia, even over nuclear issues, which means for me, it's just been a surreal experience seeing, Putin now threatening nuclear, war again. So they said, let's modulate NATO expansion. Let's have a halfway house. In other words, let's not just draw a new NATO, non-NATO line across Europe. Let's have this institution called the Partnership for Peace that will blur that line. We can still put countries in NATO. We'll just be a little vague about how exactly that's going to happen. And that vagueness is an asset. And so what we'll do is we'll create this intermediate institution, the Partnership for Peace. We'll let countries both from former Central Europe and the former Soviet Union join. So post-Soviet states can join too. And so we'll have this institution that will create loose affiliations for a large number of countries with NATO. We won't rub it in the face of the Russians, but gradually within that process, the states that perform well in peacekeeping exercises and so forth, we can gradually bring them on board. In other words, this created optionality for the United States. It created an ability to manage contingency. As states did better or worse, then you could bring them on or not bring them on. And this also, by the way, and this is hugely important, this created a berth for Ukraine. And because Ukraine could and did join. One of the biggest surprises in my research was the extent to which Clinton understood that the key to peace in Europe was finding a berth for Ukraine. He said this repeatedly in public and in private. He said to the Central and Eastern Europeans, who didn't like this because they wanted full membership, he said to them, why should we draw a new line across Europe just a little bit to the east, right? We're ignoring the post-Soviet states. They're being ignored in this whole NATO debate. We're particularly ignoring Ukraine. Ukraine is the linchpin of peace in Europe. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but the exact quotations are in my book. And the Central and Eastern Europeans didn't like it, but Clinton said to them, literally to Lech Walesa, to his face, you of all people should understand the dangers of drawing a new line for Europe and what it means to get left on the wrong side of that line, since you had to sit behind the Cold War line. And the Poles didn't like it, but they understood what he was saying. And so through clenched teeth, they accepted this, and the Partnership for Peace was instituted. So this is not a counterfactual, this was policy. And this was great because let's put NATO expansion at the end rather than at the beginning of the process. It meant there was no clear beauty contest with a line where, it would be insulting to places that are the bad line, right? So having figured out what I think was a sensible policy response, it wasn't beloved, right? People didn't like it, but it was at least minimally acceptable to all stakeholders. Having figured that out, then unfortunately, largely because of Yeltsin's self-harming choices, Clinton then implemented that and then rapidly pushed it aside. Yeltsin invades Chechnya, is hugely brutal. The Central and Eastern Europeans say, whoa, wait a minute. We said we were okay with the partnership? No. Now we need Article 5. Meanwhile, the Republican Party in the US is pushing very hard to expand Article 5, to draw that new Article 5 line. They win the midterm congressional elections in 1994 in spectacular fashion. Those are voters Clinton needs if he wants to get reelected, so he pays attention to that. And importantly, Ukraine has by now started denuclearizing. Because of the Budapest Memorandum, it agreed to give up its nuclear weapons. And so it suddenly seems less crucial to give Ukraine a berth. And so for all these reasons, Clinton shifts late 94, early 95, and he shifts to doing exactly what he said he wasn't going to do, drawing a new line across Europe between Article 5 and non-Article 5 Europe. So now you have a loss of options to manage contingency, right? Now, all you can do is put countries all the way in NATO or not, right? Wouldn't it be great if now we had some options for Ukraine other than 100% NATO or not, but we don't, right? You also immediately create a line, right, of who's going to be in next. And then you bring up these issues with, then have to debate with the British, which is, okay, well, then how far are we going to go? And the Brits are like, well, if we're going to do it this way, it's kind of dumb to do it more than once because we're just going to make the Russians mad. But the Americans say, no, no, no. And another shock for me was Strobe Talbot, who in public is sort of generally known as someone who's, friendly to Russia because he spoke Russian and spent time there. Strobe was very hardline on Russia. Already by the early 90s, he was saying NATO enlargement will not be done until it includes the Baltics. And so we have to set it up so that it keeps going to the Baltics. They had an internal acronym, SIBROD, S-I-B-R-O-D. SIBROD, small is beautiful, robust open door. So in other words, that's the manner of NATO expansion, and that's what I'm opposed to. The idea is you intentionally only take small tranches to make clear you're going to keep marching along, until you get to the Baltics, just maximizing aggravation with Moscow all along the way. And it corrodes the nuclear disarmament, as Bill Perry predicted. Bill Perry, in fact, came this close to resigning, the Secretary of Defense, over this. And in his 2015 memoir, which I recommend everyone read, My Journey to the Nuclear Brink, he says he wished in hindsight that he had resigned. He said the risks and damage of premature NATO enlargement were even worse than I feared. Not NATO enlargement, but premature NATO enlargement, rushing the decision. And that blew the big play in Europe, which was to establish a cooperative, lasting relationship with Russia. So my objection is to how NATO expansion happened.
Thank you. So we're beginning to run out of time now, but we've got lots of questions. We haven't actually really addressed the current crisis directly. Robert Wallace, who's a journalist, frequent attender at our events, wants to know how the current crisis could have been avoided. And I think your answer has just been given, which is, from your point of view, sticking with Partnership for Peace might have offered that option. But can I pick you up then on something you say in the book, which is that really, we should address how can knowledge of history guide efforts to create a better future. So it's a kind of applied history. And I suppose the thing that's uppermost in everybody's mind listening to is, if you were now advising President Biden, taking into account everything you said about the history, what would you suggest he does next?
Yes, it's a very hard question, obviously, to come up with policy advice. I should say, by the way, I see in the audience that you have Roderick Braithwaite in the audience. I learned so much from his writings in this period. It was also clear to me the White House learned a great deal. It's amazing how much reports written by Roderick Braithwaite would circulate up to Clinton and get heavily marked up. And I'm also very grateful to him for a very kind review in the Financial Times. I'm wishing right in this moment that he were here and on the camera, not me, because he is obviously has much greater skill at policymaking. I obviously think right now we don't have any really good options right now. As you correctly said, it would be great if we could get into a time machine and go back and recreate the Partnership for Peace, because I think that would give us options to manage contingency, but that's not a very realistic plan. I think now that I should also say, by the way, that the idea, well, this way, I haven't talked to Biden, but a number of government offices have reached out to me. So I have been impressed by the desire on the part of people currently in office in the National Security Council, the State Department, shall we say, people who work in Northern Virginia, to understand this history. And so I've been trying to help as best I can by conveying history to people who are trying to understand it and use it, and who are literally applying history. So I can say from personal experience that this is happening, and they're trying to understand how we got to where we are. The problem is now that we have fighting, now we're in a moment where contingency is taking over. Things are very fragile, moving very quickly. I believe that we need to try a combination of things. Obviously, I don't know if these will succeed. Obviously, these are things people smarter than I am have already figured out. We need to do the sanctions as we have been doing them. We need to get all possible aid to the Ukrainians. And we need, I think, to figure out a way to inspire the small circle of powerful people around Putin that their future would be better without him. As Sun Tzu said, you want to build your enemy a golden bridge to retreat across. In other words, you want to make an exit as attractive as possible, a golden bridge, right? I don't think there's really an off-ramp for Putin anymore, personally. I don't really know that we can build him a golden bridge. He seems to have gotten bitter during his isolation over COVID. He apparently is very COVID phobic, so he spent huge amounts of time cut off from all his advisors, stewing over Ukraine, coming up with this crazy plan that he's executing now in tragic fashion. I think he seems to have priced in this grim future into his decisions. The problem is, or I hope the problem is, that the people around him are not ready to live in the equivalent of North Korea for the rest of their lives, particularly the wealthy and the powerful who have flats in London, who have, boats off the coast of France, and didn't sign up necessarily to, work for Kim, the equivalent of Kim Jong-il. So we need to find a way to inspire them to see a better future without Putin. We also need to find a way to inspire the Russian people. I was very heartened, particularly because I used to live there, to see the photos out of Berlin on Sunday. There were, as many of you know, there were almost 100,000 people who went on a peaceful march in support of Ukraine. And what was notable to me about the pictures coming out of that march was the following. If you look at the pictures, many of them showed, huge amount of people with the Brandenburg Gate in the background. If you Google this, you will see this. The Brandenburg Gate is obviously hugely symbolic. That's where on November 9th, 1989, the power of the people brought down the wall and brought down the tyrants in East Germany. And so looking at that, I thought, you need to be wary of what you have started, Mr. Putin. There are popular forces that can sweep away a tyrant, and you saw them in Germany in 1989. And so, although in the short term, I don't think the West has any very good options, I think in the longer term, it is possible that Putin may have unleashed forces that he cannot control. I don't know if we could get Roderick Braithwaite on here for 2 minutes to give his point of view or not, if he would be willing. I see his name staring at me on the participants list. If he would be willing, I would be interested. I actually would very much like to hear his thoughts.
I'm not sure is that practically possible, David. I don't think it is. We've only 2 minutes left, I'm afraid.
Got you. Okay.
For this session. And you have your next meeting.
I do, sadly, yes, I do.
As you said. So, but obviously everybody knows Roderick Braithwaite's contribution as ambassador to Moscow in other ways, and also he's written extensively on this subject, so his work is a matter of record. But I'm afraid that is all we have time for now. It's been a really interesting session. Whether what we're seeing now is an event or a process, I think only time will tell, obviously. But I can't think of anybody better, Mary, than to write about this in due course than you, to take it to its new level. But we certainly understand the background to the events we're seeing now much better than we did before. So that's it, I'm afraid. Many thanks to you, Mary, for coming on, because I know you have loads of engagements, lots of people really interested in your work. And to you, the audience, thank you for your engagement, your questions. I couldn't get to all of them, but I do hope you will stay tuned to the Center for Geopolitics. And if you're not on our mailing list, do sign up. But for now, that's it.
All right. Thank you very much.